Let's start with George in Mexico. Thank you for listening from Mexico, George. And he says it's simply the age-old question, variously put. Is it indispensable in the interest of a strong Christian faith to be able to reconcile the findings of science with the literal interpretation of the Bible?
Oh my goodness. Two big questions there. I sometimes say to people, the trouble is you think the jigsaw has pieces of this shape and you're trying to fit them together like that, but actually over time that piece of the jigsaw has got out of shape and so has this piece. So the phrase the findings of science is always in fact fluid.
Yes.
Every scientific finding is a hypothesis in need of verification, and again it may take a generation or two, but then along comes Einstein who says, actually, we've been doing it wrong. Now we need to do it like this. And that goes on. And likewise, what do we mean by the literal interpretation? And obviously, over the last 2 centuries, the question of the Bible being, quote, literally true, unquote, has been massive, particularly in North America, where a particular strain of rationalism came in with the Enlightenment broadly, the 18th century, and much of American Christianity seized onto that in a false war, a phony war between people saying it's all rubbish, it's all myth, it's all just made up, and other people saying no, it's all literally true, and pinning that onto the idea of the authority of Scripture, which comes through in Protestantism ever since the Reformation, that if you're challenging the authority of the Pope or the Church, well, what you got instead? Well, it's the Bible. So the Bible must be literally true, otherwise we don't know what to believe. And then so the Protestant emphasis on the Bible comes together with the Enlightenment emphasis on rationalism, and you got a big problem, especially when then Epicurean scientists like Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, are saying we've got to look at the way the world makes itself, which is ancient Epicureanism with a modern twist. And then Charles Darwin eventually gets on a boat and discovers some turtles and finches and so on and says, bingo, got it, this is how it all works, sort of. But then the new thing there is the survival of the fittest. And people forget that what that means is, like the idea of monkeys typing Shakespeare, and you've got to imagine really rather a lot of near misses. So for evolution to work, you have to stretch it out over massive millennia. And the ancient Epicureans saw this as well as the modern ones. This is not a modern idea. But this is where the idea of evolutionary development, which I think most modern Christians would happily accept in some way or form, gets hooked up with a modern idea of progress, that actually this is where everything is progressing, and therefore we, the scientists, are telling you the way the world is, we're telling you the way history is going. That's where the problem comes, because actually science doesn't do that, and actually nor does a so-called literal interpretation of Genesis either.
And very often when we're talking about the quote-unquote literal interpretation of Genesis, we're talking about the very early chapters, and we're talking about the creation narrative.
Absolutely.
And in that sense, you know, this is a question from me rather than a listener, though I think a lot of listeners will be asking this question, is simply, if in a nutshell you were asked to say to someone who's confused, how am I supposed to read Genesis if it's not a scientific description of how the world came to be? What is it I am reading?
There are several layers, and we loosely refer to it as poetry. And of course, it isn't poetry in the sense that it isn't composed in the same way as, say, the Psalms are. It doesn't have that kind of verse structure. But it's poetic in the sense that, as only poetry can, it's saying 3 or 4 or 5 things at the same time. And my friend and colleague John Walton from Wheaton College has written very helpfully on this in terms of the ancient Near Eastern world that forms the context within which Genesis would have meant what it meant.
The Lost World of Genesis, I think, is
That's
one of
right.
those. Yeah.
He's written several books and a commentary on Genesis, I think 2 commentaries on Genesis, if I remember rightly. And part of the point there is that this description of something being created in 6 stages, ending with an image being put into it, is the creation of a temple.
The image being humankind.
In Genesis 1, yes. If you create something, this structure which is a heaven and earth structure, which it is, and if the last thing to go in is an image, and then the God who's made it takes his rest, that's coming in to take possession. This is now God's home. This is where he wants to be with his human creatures. And so it's a way of saying look at the whole creation the way we look at a temple. And then it also means turning it round, look at the temple in Jerusalem as a microcosm of the whole creation. Right. And certainly the decoration of the temple indicates that, as in the tabernacle in the wilderness as well. So that suddenly a whole world of cosmology is opened up, which has got nothing whatever to do with were these 6 periods of 24 hours. Now, actually, most British Christians, and I think most Christians around the world, don't get hung up on the 6 periods of 24 hours in the way that some Americans still feel they have to. And it's a shame. It's because that major event happened in American culture, the Scopes trial in, was it 1929, something like that? It was somewhere around there, which, you know, nobody else could have had that. That was a post-Civil War, Northern liberals versus Southern conservatives flexing their theological muscles. And everyone wanted to know what was going to happen about this, because it was sort of, are we going to be in the modern world or the ancient world, with all sorts of overtones. That was a very America-specific thing. And I never tire of saying this, because these questions regularly come from America, and people often don't realize how peculiar that context is. That needs demystifying.
Yes, the cultural context often determines the kinds of questions people are asking.